So, what I'm going to do today is give you a really big picture of a slice of history. My reasoning being that most of you are not historians of philosophy, so it's probably going to be easier and I hope more interesting for you if I give you a big picture presentation, rather than go into a little thing in lots and lots of precise historical detail. So, okay, so this 50-year period that I'm going to be talking about was a really tumultuous time for British metaphysics. And so during these 50 years, we saw philosophers go from thinking that time is definitely unreal to thinking, no, time is definitely real and it's static, to thinking that time is real and it's dynamic. And I'm interested in how and why this 50-year period occurred. So I want to say a little bit about why these 50 years is of particular interest. And one reason is simply that it gave rise to metaphysics that the philosophers themselves thought was really new. So in our most famous paper of the entire period, J.M.E. McTaggart's The Unreality of Time, he opens this paper by saying that he offers a new argument for the unreality of time, and whilst the thesis isn't new, his argument is. A lot of philosophers of the period think that they are offering new arguments and new theories. So you can find similar statements in papers by Bertrand Russell, Samuel Alexander, Susan Stebbing. Philosophers of this period also really cared about time. So in the 1920s, you get the very first studies of the history and philosophy of time that have ever been written in English produced. And you get 4 of them within a 20-year period. So we have Heath, Reifer, Clue, and Gunn. All of them are giving histories of the philosophy of time, and they're giving overviews of contemporary philosophy of time. This has never happened before in the English language. Not only do you have these books appearing on time, you get philosophers publishing lots and lots on time. So here is some crude quantitative work I've undertaken simply by looking at the number of journal articles published in leading English language philosophy journals that have time in their titles. And you see quite a sharp increase from the 1880s up to the 1920s, and then the interest kind of tails off again. Now, this is crude because not every journal article that is about time necessarily has the word time in its title. And of course, you are going to have some journal articles that have the word time in their titles that are not about time. But nonetheless, I think you can see that there is a substantial amount of interest here. Finally, I hope that this study is going to be of interest to contemporary metaphysicians of time, because some of the texts produced during this period, so we have McTaggart, William James, Bertrand Russell's On the Experience of Time, we have C.D. Broad's Scientific Thought, and they have enjoyed a massive citation jump over the last 2 decades. So they're not being cited back in the 1920s, they're being cited now in the 2000 and 2010s onwards. And it seems to be from 21st century philosophers of time who are looking to contextualize or find historical ancestors to their own work. So for all these reasons, I think that looking at this 50-year period in the history of philosophy is of interest to philosophers of time. Okay, so what I'm going to do in this section is just introduce the period in a bit more detail. The way that I should say, no one else has ever written on this before, so everything I'm going to say is going to be from me, which means I could probably just make it up as I go along, but let's hope I'm not doing that. I'm basing this on having read almost everything that has been written in English during this period on time. And as I see it, there are 3 phases across these 50 years. So phase 1 occurs in the 1860s onwards. And on phase 1, time is held to be ultimately unreal. And this view is held by a wide swathe of British idealists. So we have at the top Edward Caird, T.H. Green, F.H. Bradley, E.G. Ritchie, Jeremy McTaggart. We've also got Victoria Welby, part of phase 1. She's not a British idealist, but I'll tell you a little bit more about her later. So for all of these people, time is ultimately unreal. What I mean when I say that time is unreal is that for these thinkers, nothing is ultimately before or after anything else. It's certainly not past, present, or future, but even more fundamental than that, it is not before or after at the ultimate level of reality. It might appear to be so, but it's not really. So when these people say that time is unreal, they're not messing about. Phase 2, I think, kicks off around the 1890s. So here you get a group of philosophers who argue, time is real, and they take time to be static. So here, again, we have quite a broad swathe of figures. We've got Shadworth Hodgson and Oliver Lodge, and they are old school empiricists. We've got F.C.S. Schiller, he's a pragmatist. Simon Alexander, he is a British emergentist. The most famous of them all, Bertrand Russell, an early analytic. And then we have Braithwaite, who was another early analytic. Phase 3, I think, kicks off from the 1910s. And on this phase, philosophers agree that time is real, but they disagree that time is static. So to my mind, all of these philosophers are saying time is real, but it is dynamic in some fundamental way. And this includes a couple more idealists, perhaps surprisingly. So we have May Sinclair, Hilda Oakley, R.G. Collingwood on the idealist side of things. We then have another couple of emergentists. We've got Whitehead, C.B. Broad, and then we have another couple of new realists. So Susan Stebbing and Arthur Eddington. What I want to discuss in a bit more detail is what I mean when I say that time is static or dynamic. And I'm going to pick out 3 points of disagreement. And I think that these disagreements are all fairly standard. And I also think that you will all be extremely familiar with them. So the very first point of debate is whether the past, present, and future all exist. So as we all know well, presentists say only the present exists. Eternalists say past, present, and future exist. Static theorists will say that all 3 exist. Dynamic theorists will generally say that only the present exists. And I'm going to label that theory dynamic because if you hold that view, you will almost certainly hold that what is present changes. Second point of debate is whether there is a privileged present. Of course, the B theorist will say that there's not, whereas the A theorist will say that there is. And again, I'm going to say that if you think there is a privileged present, you're going to hold a dynamic theory of time because you will almost certainly hold that what is present changes. Final point of debate is whether time has an intrinsic direction. So usually, if you think that time has an intrinsic direction, you're going to think that that manifests in some way like a moving present. So usually, if you think time has an intrinsic direction, you're going to be a dynamic theorist. And if you think that time lacks direction intrinsically, perhaps its direction is merely given by causality, say, then you're going to be a static theorist. Just language-wise, the way that I am going to use these terms is that you are a static theorist if you hold static answers to all three of these debates. If you hold at least one dynamic answer, then I'm going to label you a dynamic theorist, just for the point of how I'm going to discuss these philosophers. These three debates are obviously interconnected. So a person who holds a static answer to one will likely hold it to all three. So Bertrand Russell, for example, takes the static option on all three issues, whereas someone like C.D. Broad takes the dynamic option on all three issues. Okay, I also think, and I'm going to flag this now because it's controversial, but I think it's interesting. I think that all three of these debates were actually invented during the period I'm looking at. I don't think they were present in the history of philosophy before. And I'll say a bit more about what I mean by that shortly. So what I want to do now is go through the different phases with you in more detail. So phase one, why did all these people come to think that time is unreal? Prior to the 1860s, British philosophers were not particularly interested in the metaphysics of time. So there are many, many leading philosophers of the period, including Jeremy Bentham, Adam Smith, Edmund Burke, William Godwin, Catherine Macaulay, Wollstonecraft, Mary Everest Ball, George Ball, James Mill. None of these thinkers wrote anything on the metaphysics of time. And I think that's partly because of the Scottish Enlightenment, which discouraged metaphysical thinking generally. So it just was not a big topic in the early parts of the 19th century. Even when the odd account of the nature of time appeared, so you do get brief accounts in the likes of J.S. Mill, William Whewell. They tend to be really brief and Kantian. I mean, really brief. They might be like a paragraph long. There just isn't much interest in the metaphysics of time at all. This changes in the 1860s with the rise of British idealism. And suddenly, the unreality of time just becomes one of the big topics within philosophy. So if we take green here, top middle, green tells us that there is an eternal consciousness, an absolute, and that consciousness is out of time. And in fact, because the consciousness comprises the world is out of time as well. So time is unreal. Edward Caird, top left, it tells us that the absolute is fundamentally outside of time, yet we can understand time in a way as development, as a kind of appearance within the absolute. F.H. Bradley very famously argues that time is contradictory and hence unreal. And all of these thinkers, they are teaching from the 1860s and they begin publishing from the 1870s. And so many British philosophers follow them. Every philosopher and his dog has something to say on time in this period. And I say he because the British idealists were almost exclusively male. Okay, so why are they all suddenly getting interested in the metaphysics of time when there's been half a century of disinterest? Well, I think part of the reason is that metaphysics was central to idealism. I think another part of the reason lies in evolution. So Darwin famously published his evolutionary theory in 1859 on the origin of species. And what Darwin also did was popularize the notion of deep time. So Darwin showed that the Earth is not thousands of years old, but millions of years old. And he drew on geological research of his day to do so. But Darwin needed deep time because for Darwin, the evolutionary mechanisms that he proposed could only work if you had millions and millions of years. And he's explicit about this in The Origin of Species. So there's a section titled On the Lapse of Time, which tells us thankfully, geology shows us that there was enough time for evolution as he understands it to have occurred. So Darwinian evolution requires deep time. This thesis was picked up really quickly, and there's a whole host of scientific popularizers who begin writing kind of semi-fictional evolutionary epics where they describe how the Earth was born millions of years ago, and then how evolution came to start. So very quickly, evolution and deep time get tied together. Further evidence for the connection between them can be found in the studies of time I mentioned earlier. So 2 of the 4 books on time actually devote sections or chapters to the effect of evolution on time. And they both agree that it was enormous. So one of them tells us that geology and evolution gave philosophy immensely more time to think about. And another tells us that geology shows us to be time is a serious factor in reality, and evolution shows it to be a vital, influential factor. So these philosophers were really aware that time was at the heart of Darwinian evolution. Now, Darwinian evolution also led towards the Victorian crisis of faith. So Victorian Britain was already worrying about religion, but Darwin kind of pushed them over the edge. And lots of people were really worried about that because they were really religious, and they didn't want Darwin to push the world towards atheism. British idealism was, in the early days, an exceptionally religious movement. Green and Caird were both ordained. Like they were really anxious to show that Darwin was either irrelevant to philosophy or just wrong. And I think that if you put all of this together and try and step into the boots of a Victorian philosopher who is pro-religion and anti-Darwin, if you are an idealist, you have a strategy open to you to disregard evolution, and that is to say that time is unreal. Because if time is ultimately an unreal appearance, then evolution definitely is. And I actually think that is what drove the 1860s move against the reality of time. Okay, so phase 2. Why did people come to think that time is real and static? So these thinkers really are quite a mixed bunch. They're coming from many different movements within philosophy. And I think there's a few obvious reasons that push them towards realism about time. One of the most obvious is scientific naturalism. All these thinkers wanted their metaphysics to be at least compatible with science, if not actually driven by science. And if you think that that evolution is a key part of science, then you're going to want to affirm the reality of time in order to affirm the reality of evolution. Why think that time is real but static, though? So it's the static bit that I find particularly interesting. And I think part of the reason they all thought time was static is, so this is the evolution issue. The static issue, I think, is Hegel, actually. So all these thinkers were educated in the Hegelian tradition, and I think they all had a bit of a Hegelian hangover. So for Hegel, the world exists simpliciter. It is not the case that there is a moving present, that things fall in and out of reality. Reality as a whole, it exists. And there are passages, even in the likes of Russell, that really sound like they could have come from Hegel, or at least from the British Hegelians, which were their medium in this issue. So I think Hegel is a massive factor in why they turn to the staticness of time. The next reason, I think, is due to the spatialization of time. Now, there's surprisingly little on what the spatialization of time means. I'm going to characterize it in two ways. So I'm going to say that if you are semi-spatializing time, you are applying the features of space to time. If you're fully spatializing time, then I'm going to say you are thinking of time literally as a kind of space. But for now, I'm just going to talk about the practice of semi-spatializing time. In the late 19th century, I think that philosophers focused on a couple of really specific features in space that they then apply to time. One of these features is that the parts of space coexist. So just like on this map, France, Spain, Germany, they all coexist. And when you apply that feature to time, you end up with all the parts of time coexisting also. The next feature of space is that no part, let's go back to this, no part of space is privileged over its other parts. So we happen to be Barcelona, but that's no more privileged than Madrid or Paris. And I think exactly the same applies to their conceptions of time. There's no privileged present. 1980 is on the same ontological standing as 2022. The final feature of space that I think they were applying is that, of course, we can move in multiple directions through space, north, south, east, west. And when you apply that to time, you end up with the idea that we can move backwards or forwards in time. When these thinkers spatialized time, they drew on an older tradition coming from the likes of Aristotle and Newton, but they also drew on various new scientific ideas. And this includes geology, where people were beginning to realize that you could see the layers of deep time in rock strata. And this kind of thing became illustrated in a lot of scientific periodicals. People got quite excited about it. People were also beginning to realize that because light takes time to travel, when you are looking into outer space, you are seeing into the past. And all these ways are ways of spatializing time, like literally seeing the parts of time in space. People were also beginning to realize that space might have more than 3 dimensions. Here is Charles Hinton's classic drawing of what a 4-dimensional cube might look like. And perhaps that 4th dimension is time. So there was a lot of ideas around the 4th dimension, and the idea of identifying the 4th dimension with time became really popular. So all these ideas were disseminated through some really popular works. So we have Felix Eberty, who is telling us that light takes time to travel through outer space. We have mathematician Charles Hinton, who really, really popularized the idea of more than 3 spatial dimensions. And he very strongly hints that we should identify the 4th dimension with time. We have things like flatland, which I'm guessing most of you will have heard of, which again is all about how many spatial dimensions are there. And then, of course, most famously of all, we have H.G. Wells, the time machine, who literally tells us that time is a kind of space, and that's why we can travel back and forth along it. I'm going to give a shout out to Welby here because I've been working on her really recently. So Welby doesn't just semi-spatialize time. She doesn't just apply the features of space to time. She goes the whole hog and literally conceives time as a kind of space to the extreme that she ends up arguing time is unreal. Time is just an idea in our minds. What's real is a 4th dimension of space. So she's really taking the spatialization of time as far as it can go, to the point where time ends up not being a feature of the real world. What's really a feature of the world is just an extra spatial dimension. Okay, so I'd like to say a bit about this debate that emerged between the phase 2 theorists who think that time is real but static, and the phase 3 theorists who think that time is real but dynamic. It took quite a long time for this debate to emerge. And that is because, in my view, this debate was new. And it wasn't these particular points of issue, whether we have a privileged present, whether the past is real or not, were not issues that had been articulated before. So before the late 19th century, in Western history philosophy of time, you can certainly find philosophers who seem to be presentists, arguably Thomas Hobbes, for example, or eternalists, arguably Newton, and even some people read Aristotle as a growing block theorist. I agree. I think that these readings are quite plausible. But what you do not find in this historical philosophy is the question articulated, is the past and future real? And then people having a debate about it, or asking, is the present privileged? And people having a debate about it. Rather, I think people are taking positions on these debates without actually explicitly having the debate. It's as though the questions are kind of submerged because they haven't been clearly brought to the surface yet. What I think happens slowly from the late 19th century is that these questions are brought to the surface, and people begin explicitly asking, is the past or future real? And then explicitly taking positions on this debate, rather than just sort of holding positions in the absence of asking the questions. So let me give you some examples, because this might help. So in 19th century philosophy, I certainly have not found anyone in the British American tradition who explicitly asked, does the past and future exist? The first time that I find this question articulated in English is actually in the work of this guy, Hermann Lotze. So he's a German philosopher, but his relevant book was translated by some British idealists. And in this book, he explicitly asks, does the past and future exist? So this book was translated in 1884. This leads to, a couple of years later, a symposium at the Aristotelian Society titled, Does the Past and Future Exist? And then you get three philosophers having a debate about it, taking various positions. And I think that it's from this point onwards that the question very slowly becomes explicit and people are articulating it. It still takes time for that to happen, but by like Russell's 1915 on the experience of time paper, I think it is explicit. Russell is explicitly bringing up this issue and answering it, and even more obviously, that's happening in the work of Eddington in 1920, and then broad scientific thought in 1923. So that's the first debate. Does the past or future exist? Second debate, is the present privileged? Fairly obviously, this debate between the A and the B theorist gets its first articulation in McTaggart's 1908 paper. But it still took longer than you might think for it to be picked up. So there are a couple of very early responses to it. And because of the First World War, the whole thing is dropped. And it really gets picked up again in the 1920s by the likes of C.D. Broad onwards. And from that point, I think you find it really clearly articulated. The third debate about whether or not time has an intrinsic direction, I think becomes explicit in the work of these guys. So Alexander he's definitely musing about it. Broad is reading Alexander musing about it. They have a correspondence about it. And then, of course, Arthur Eddington really famously popularizes the question of the arrow of time a little bit later. And here is one of his famous diagrams in Eddington's book, um, where we have the arrow of time moving from the past to the future. Okay, so this is how I think the three debates got going between the dynamic and the static theorists. Once the dynamic theories were getting off the ground, and they are drawing inspiration from a couple of sources in particular. So one is experimental psychology. Experimental psychology didn't start until the 1860s, and it really got going in the 1880s. And then when William James begins writing on the perception of time in that famous 1886 paper, that it is, yeah, yeah, I know these dates far too well. So William James begins collecting all this experimental psychology together. And from then on, it's really turbo powering dynamic theories of time, because people are saying that, hey, it looks as though we experience some kind of temporal passage. Surely our metaphysics should reflect that. And in particular, then we get worries about the specious present, and that maybe the specious present has to be a feature of a dynamic theory of time. These issues it sort of get going. And the other source they are really drawing on, again, is evolution. And this time, they're drawing on the idea, arguably implicit in Darwin, that time itself is a kind of ontological force to bring things in and out of existence. Right? So Darwin actually makes statements like this. He says things like, through the power of time, this occurs. And Darwin presumably means this metaphorically, but these philosophers are taking it pretty literally, that time is literally a powerful force in the world. And for the dynamic theorists, who then begin drawing on the likes of Bergson, this is a way that they are powering their dynamic theories of time. Okay, so what we find today is that phase one has largely dropped out of the debate. No one now really thinks time is unreal, but phases 2 and 3 are still going strong. And for largely the same reason, that dynamic theories of time are still drawing on psychological, experimental psychology, for example. I'm going to leave this here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Emily. So, yeah, please, other questions? So, oh my God, okay. So the best thing would be, okay, for me to pass the microphone. So,
Hi, Emily. Thanks for that. Always a fan of your stuff. And good to see a lot of figures that are familiar to me, precisely because you've told me about them before. So Samuel Alexander, I wanted to hear more about, because you've put him in the static camp, and someone who I spoke to about him before said, no, he's like the original growing blocker. He's got this really, I think it was you. So I was wondering if you could just sort of clarify where he fits in a bit more there.
Thank you, I can. So what I have argued before, and I think is true, is that Alexander was the first person to articulate the growing block theory of time. And he does so really clearly. He paints a picture of time as a carpet that's slowly unrolling, and the unrolling bit is the present. And Alexander does that by way of clarifying the fact that this is not his view. And so he paints the growing block theory of time and then goes on to say, but on my view, past, present, future, all exist. And what's interesting about this is that C.D. Broad read Samuel Alexander extremely closely, and they corresponded about precisely this issue in letters. And then a couple of months later, C.D. Broad writes Scientific Thoughts, which is where he then defends the growing block theory of time. Right, so that's how I think he fits in. Thank you. That's a cool question.
Yeah, this was super interesting. Partially because I just don't know a lot about these like historically how they fit together. But one thing I was curious about was you talked a lot about like science and these sorts of things like leading to these positions, but have you thought about things like the way that like film, for example, and like the advent of like popularized movies might have changed? Like I'm curious about how that sort of like might have fitted with this like evolution of how we think about time.
Thank you. I have thought about that. So the reason that I haven't mentioned it in this talk is simply because the philosophers that I'm studying talk about stuff like evolution and psychology, and they don't talk very much about film. Now, of course, the massive exception to this, he's not British, but Henry Bergson. So Bergson takes the new art of cinematography, as it was then known, and he holds this up saying, it looks like this art is spatializing time because we can, he's looking at people like Julian Marais, he's a photographer, he published a book in the 1860s called Movement, and he time-lapsed a horse's gallop. And Bergson says, you might think this shows you how time works, but you're all wrong, because in fact, this gives you a false illusion of how time works. Because how time works is really something that we intuit, it's not something that we can see spatially. So he's holding that up as an example of what went wrong. Now, Bertrand Russell does discuss this, but Russell seems to be doing it sort of after the fact. That's my impression, that Russell finds the stuff and takes it to confirm the theory that he already held. Whereas, rather than inspiring it. There may be an exception to this, which is Victoria Welby, because she doesn't mention it in her published work, but in her archives, she collects lots of newspaper clippings about the new arts of photography. And she obviously thinks time is a kind of space. And I think that for her, there might be that link there. But again, it's not explicit. But thanks.
Thanks. I wanted to ask about the people in phase one. Do we have any other kind of evidence from their other writings, or I don't know, things we know about their lives that that part of what drove them to the view that time is unreal was the kind of, you know, religious backlash against Darwin? I think that's really interesting. Like, you know, think other things about I don't know, their writings or their personal correspondence.
Thank you. The short answer is no. So what's extremely well documented is that they are pro-religion and anti-Darwinian evolution. Like, that's very straightforward, like found explicitly in many of their works. I haven't found the smoking gun that would say I reject the reality of time by way of rejecting the reality of evolution. So that's just an argument that I am making. What I have found is a lot of the early realists saying, I defend the reality of time because I defend the reality of evolution. And they make that claim explicitly, which again leads me to think that they are reacting to an implicit movement. But no direct evidence, it merely, I think it fits the fact.
I have a question about a different strand that you didn't talk about, and I'm sort of curious about. So before these folks, you have people talking about, before these folks, you have people talking about causal theories of time. After, you have people like Grunbaum and Reichenbach talking about causal theories of time. And I feel like there's got to be some people here talking about causal theories of time, particularly because Russell was an famous anti-realist about causation, at least in one paper. So I'm just wondering, like, is there a connection between the before and after through this work for causal theories of time?
That's a great question. I not that I found, is the honest answer. There are a couple of history, like, so the Van Frassen, one of his very early books on the history of space and time, he does give a brief history of the causal theory of time that covers this period. And actually, the material that he's found, I don't find ties into this. My impression is that these causal theories, I don't know why, but they're either in the US, that there are a couple of early causal theorists there. Mary Calkins is an early causal theorist who is not mentioned in his history. But on the UK side of things, it's just not something. It's just not something that I've found. I was expecting to, and I haven't. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why, but I suspect it's because evolution was powering so much of this. Like it was powering the anti-realists, but then it was also powering the dynamic theorists. This whole Bergsonian idea that evolution is a power in itself. I get the impression that that took center stage rather than anything else. But thanks. Good question.
Cool, thanks.
Just briefly, so one of your ideas was that endorsing theories according to which time is not real was a reaction to evolutionary theory on the part of theologians. That would presuppose that for most theologians, or for those at least who engaged in this line of argument, time is not real for religious reasons as well. Is that correct? I mean, usually I think religious thinkers do take time as very essential to their understanding of the world from a religious perspective. So how would that work for them? Certainly Christians and the Judeo-Christian tradition, the reality of time is important. So it would be a bit of a problem to...
Thank you. I can. So the anti-realism about time is found in British idealism, which is a really specific philosophical movement. It's a specific movement that nonetheless just came to dominate British philosophy, not quite entirely, but like 95%, I would say, up until around 1900. And although the British idealists were deeply religious, they were not traditionally Christian. So they have been described as being on the side of religion and as being like, they're very kind of spiritual, and they all want to identify the absolute with God, but the very fact that they are positing an absolute consciousness as opposed to a traditional Christian God is already quite a distance between them. And then they are a bit concerned with explaining how time feels like such a real appearance in the world. They're concerned to a greater lesser extent about that. McTaggart, I would say, is by far the most concerned, and much of his work is just explaining that question. They really took time to not be an essential factor in reality. It was something to be explained away rather than something to be put at the heart of a metaphysic. I will also stress that this religious aspect is very much something you find in the first wave of British idealists, so sort of 1860 to 1880, that they're the really, really religious ones. In fact, Bradley is famously pretty atheist, and so is McTaggart. I mean, arguably they're spiritual, but they're definitely not in the pro-religious camp in the way that Caird and Green are. Yes, that's my answer really. Religious, but not traditionally Christian, and they're not hugely fussed about time.
Thanks, that was great. I just wanted to ask about, there was one kind of absence I thought that, and you can't mention everybody, but I thought I'm just curious where this person sort of lands here. I mean, so I was a little, he's the craziest and coolest philosophy of time theory ever, which is done in his serialism. And so it must have been influential because it then led to all of Priestley and the time plays. and it fits in nicely with your narrative in the sense that he was motivated with this kind of proto-psychology. On the other hand, you know, in terms of the metaphysics picture, it was like this kind of dynamic block theory on steroids mixed with presentism. So like when you were asleep, you were experiencing the block, and then when you woke up, you got sucked onto the now. It's just freaking awesome, and it must have been influential if it influenced Priestley and others. So I wonder where Dunn, how Dunn plays a role in this period.
Thank you for that. I have read Dunn. I haven't read him super closely yet, so I don't have really specific remarks. As you say, given the dynamism, he's definitely part of the phase 2 camp. I am actually not sure how influential he was amongst philosophers. So Susan Stebbing and C.D. Broad, they both read his work and commented on it. Stebbing didn't take it very seriously. Broad took it much more seriously. But Broad partly does so because of their shared interest in precognition. So, you know, yeah, as you know, Dunn has these various ideas about how precognition works with regards to philosophy of time. And Broad picks up on that stuff. And in his later work, Broad gets really deeply into like parapsychology and the paranormal, and then he has his own views on what precognition tells us about the metaphysics of time. But my impression, yeah, is that he wasn't particularly influential amongst philosophers, which of course does not mean that he wasn't really influential amongst other people. I will be working on Dunn, so when I have, I can tell you more. Cheers.
Okay, so we have another person, Peter Ostrom. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly.
Oh, that's fine. That's
Oh,
fine.
go ahead.
That's great. Thank you for a very interesting.
The microphone. We cannot hear you.
Oh, it's on already.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fine. Thank you for a very interesting and informative talk. I loved it. Thank you. You haven't mentioned Einstein's special relativity theory. I wonder if there's a reason for that. Didn't Einstein theory of relativity, didn't it play any role in that period? Was it later it was taken into account, or what was the reason for that? After all, it came up in 1905, so people must have known about it.
I'm not sure I caught every word of that. But from what I heard, you were asking me why relativity theory doesn't come up sooner, basically.
Yes, you haven't mentioned Einstein's special relativity, which was first published in 1905.
Okay. So when I began this project, I expected to find that relativity would have a huge impact on metaphysics of time. And actually, I have not found that to be the case, to my own surprise. There are a couple of very, very early theorists who engage with relativity, like in the 1910s onwards. So H. Wilden Carr, for example, has lots to say on relativity. And there's like a few little review pieces but by Russell and Broad, but my impression is that philosophers don't really begin taking it seriously until Eddington's 1920s work, and from then on, then people are really taking it seriously. But it seems like it just took quite a long time to kind of filter into the world of philosophy, and people really didn't know what to do with it. And special relativity filtered through a lot quicker. So people are talking about the twin paradox, for example, and how can it be that there's no universe-wide simultaneity? General relativity, I really just don't find many philosophers talking about at all until later. The big exception to this is A. Robb, the physicist, and Rick Arthur has just published a paper on Robb, arguing that he had a hugely general relativity influenced philosophy of time in the 1910s.
Hmm.
But it was the same in Italy, by the way, you
Yep.
know, because I mean, and we had also physicists like Quirino Majorana, the father of Ettore Majorana, who was against relativity theory. Yeah, I mean, we had to wait for Fermi's work. Okay, we had mathematicians that were into relativity theory, but philosophers and also theoretical physicists until the 20s, I mean, they were very skeptical with regard to relativity. They still endorse the ethers hypothesis and so on and so forth. So it's very interesting, actually. I have a small question, if I may, because you mentioned Russell, and I mean, I was wondering, what about debates on Neoplatonism that were occurring in England, you know, at the end of the 19th century? Did they play a role? Did you consider that?
Do you mean with regards to like the universal stuff?
Because it seems to me that, I mean, at least for us, we know that it's the case in the early years, especially. He was a Neoplatonist, and was wondering whether you investigated these aspects. I mean, how, because Neoplatonism is very strange in England. It's sort of, it's wave-like.
Like a
So
cyclical.
we have end of the 18th century, then back, you know, end of the 19th century, at the end of the century. it
That's
comes
true.
back in England. I don't know why. So I was wondering whether you consider.
So I definitely think that there is a heavy Hegelian idealist influence underlying the Neoplatonism, because it's still this idea that there's a kind of world behind the world.
Yeah, but that's why I thought about Platon, Neoplatonist, of
Yeah.
course, because it can be that, I mean, it played a role at some point in shaping, I mean, this dichotomy between real and unreal, reality and unreality of time, no? So, because in Plato's theory, you can read it both. I mean, if you
Yeah.
consider the time could be understood both as something very real and material, which is, you know, embodied by the motion, you know, of the stars and planets and so on. But on the other hand, it's something completely unreal from the metaphysical standpoint, does not possess the reality of the ideas. So numbers, for example, or meta, let's say this. So I was thinking about that. And
I'm not sure, and here's partly why. So Russell doesn't start off talking about the metaphysics of time with regards to the issues that I've mentioned here. So he's not interested initially in any of the static dynamic issues. What he's interested initially is relationism versus substantivalism. And there he keeps doing these 180s. So he'll defend relationism for a few years and then change his mind and be a substantivalist and then go back again. And I guess my instinct with the Neoplatonism is that I would have expected that to be a decisive influence one way or the other. And the fact that it's not, it makes me wonder if the Neoplatonism doesn't extend to his time theories. But I'm not sure. It
No,
is my
but it
honest
was
answer.
just a
Yeah, that's a
curiosity, you know.
that's a
Thank
great
you.
question. Yeah.
I have
That's
a good
cool.
news for everyone. There is coffee break now. We thank our speaker again. Thank you, Emily.